15 minutes. That's all it took for a 5-year-old girl to vanish from the face of the earth. 5-year-old Inga Gehricke disappeared on May 2, 2015, during a family barbecue at a remote German charity facility. Within a quarter hour, she had become the center of Germany's largest missing person search in history. More than 1,500 police officers, firefighters, and rescue personnel deployed across 6 days. They searched nearly 5,000 hectares of woodland. They drained every pond, every pit, every water source within miles. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single trace. 10 years later, the case remains unsolved. Inga would now be 16 years old. Saturday, May 2, 2015 started as an ordinary day for the Gehricke family. Parents Victoria and Yenzu Wei loaded their 4 children into the car for what should have been a simple weekend visit. 15-year-old Maxim, 13-year-old Julius, 8-year-old Freya, and 5-year-old Inga, the youngest. They lived in Schönebeck, a town in Saxony-Anhalt, eastern Germany. That afternoon, they drove approximately 100 kilometers to visit friends at the Diakonie Werk Wilhelmshof, a Christian charity facility near Stendal. The gathering included 3 families. 9 children total, 6 adults. It was meant to be a relaxed evening, the kind of casual get-together where parents could catch up while kids played freely across the sprawling grounds. But Wilhelmshof wasn't just any facility. This was a church-operated complex in a heavily forested area northwest of Uxbring. It provided residential care for approximately 85 people with disabilities. It offered therapeutic support for around 24 individuals recovering from alcohol and drug addiction. It operated a seminar guest house with 11 double rooms. Agricultural workshops and stables provided occupational therapy for residents. On May 2, 2015, an estimated 90-plus people were on the premises. Residents, staff members, visitors, patients' relatives who had brought children to play. The facility had open access to the public. Anyone could walk in. Anyone could walk out. And critically, just 3 to 4 kilometers away sat the Uxspringi Forensic Psychiatry Center, a facility that housed patients behind barbed wire, including convicted sex offenders. Around 6:30 that evening, the adults began preparing for the barbecue. The grill area sat at the edge of the forest, roughly 100 meters from the friend's house where they'd been visiting. A footpath connected the 2 locations. Inga's father, Yenzu Wei, last saw his youngest daughter on that footpath. She was carrying 2 1.5-liter water bottles, walking toward the grill area to help with preparations. She had long, medium blonde hair worn in plaits with bright neon yellow hair ties, blue eyes. She wore a mint blue long-sleeve shirt decorated with butterflies and ruffled shoulders, washed-out blue jeans, pink suede shoes from the brand Elefanten. One distinctive feature made Inga immediately recognizable. She was missing both upper central front teeth, creating a visible gap when she smiled. 2 other children saw her after her father did. They watched her turn around, walking back toward the house. She never arrived. Within 10 to 15 minutes, at approximately 6:45 that evening, Victoria Gehricke noticed her daughter was missing. She'd been in the kitchen buttering bread rolls for the barbecue when she realized Inga hadn't come back. The family searched frantically. On foot. By bicycle. They called Inga's name through the facility grounds. They searched the adjacent forest. They looked everywhere. Nearly 2 hours passed. At 8:15 that evening, they called police. The first patrol car arrived at 8:22. Search dogs were deployed by 10 o'clock that night. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Wilhelmshof itself. The Diakonie Werk Wilhelmshof sprawled across a massive property bordered by approximately 4,700 hectares of woodland. The facility included multiple buildings, playgrounds, sports fields, agricultural structures, ponds, a locked shed containing children's play equipment. The 100-meter footpath where Inga vanished connected the friend's house to the barbecue area at the forest's edge. This wasn't a place where a child could simply get lost and stay lost. The grounds were active, populated, monitored. Yet within 15 minutes, a 5-year-old girl, carrying water bottles, disappeared so completely that 10 years of investigation would fail to produce a single concrete answer about her fate. The property layout created multiple possibilities. The forest itself presented obvious danger, dense woodland stretching for miles in every direction. But there were also buildings with cellars, storage areas, locked rooms, agricultural structures, vehicles coming and going, residents with varying levels of cognitive function, staff members, visitors. And that psychiatric facility just kilometers away, housing individuals convicted of the most serious crimes. What followed was unprecedented in German history. Over 1,500 police officers, firefighters, and rescue personnel deployed across 6 days. More than 1,000 emergency responders arrived in the first week alone. 40-plus search dogs from multiple German states were deployed, equipped with GPS tracking devices. The search covered an area equivalent to 5,000 football fields. A police helicopter with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the forest. The thermal cameras detected wildlife, deer, wild boar, but no sign of a missing child. Every body of water within miles was systematically drained. The carp pond, the slurry pit, the fire pond. Forest ponds scattered throughout the woodland. Divers searched before the water was pumped out. Nothing. Every building on the Wilhelmshof property was searched room by room. Every cellar, every storage area, every locked space. A barn was emptied entirely by hand, officers sifting through hay and equipment. Investigators from a 30-person special unit called Ermittlungsgruppe Wald, Investigation Group Forest, questioned over 100 people from the facility. By May 7th, just 5 days after Inga vanished, police made a public statement that changed the trajectory of the investigation. They stated that abduction or crime was increasingly probable. Specialists believed that if Inga had simply gotten lost in the forest, she would have been found by now. The thermal imaging would have detected her body heat. The search dogs would have tracked her scent. The ground searches, covering thousands of hectares, would have located her remains. The GPS-equipped tracking dogs created a complete movement profile showing where Inga had been on the property before she disappeared. The data showed she had moved primarily along the forest edge, not deep into the woodland. She'd ridden her bicycle with family members earlier that day, and those traces were detected. But crucially, there was no continuous trail leading into the forest after 6:30 that evening. One investigating officer noted something that would haunt the case for years. Bloodhounds did not alert anywhere on the facility grounds or in the forest. Even if Inga had been carried to a car, the dogs should have indicated this path. The dogs should have picked up her scent if someone had carried her unconscious body. They should have tracked where a vehicle might have been parked, but there was nothing on the grounds. Then came the discovery that suggested something far more disturbing. 50 kilometers away, near the Attu Autobahn, specialized scent dogs picked up what appeared to be Inga's trail. The dogs tracked toward the Berlin Ring Road, then onto the A9 through Dessau to Halle, then onto the A14 and A4 toward Dresden. Highways were temporarily closed while search teams followed this trail. The trail was ultimately lost, but the implication was clear and terrifying. Inga may have been transported by vehicle. Someone may have taken her from that 100-meter footpath, placed her in a car or van, and driven her away from Wilhelmshof before anyone even realized she was missing. Within that 15-minute window, a 5-year-old girl may have been abducted and removed from the area before the family had even finished calling her name. No clothing belonging to Inga was ever found. Not her mint blue butterfly shirt. Not her washed-out jeans. Not her pink elephantine shoes. Not her bright neon yellow hair ties. A hair scrunchie was discovered early in the search, generating brief hope. DNA testing definitively ruled it out as not belonging to her. No DNA evidence was recovered from the facility grounds, the forest, or any of the buildings. No crime scene was ever identified. Despite the most extensive search operation in German history, investigators could not locate a single physical location where evidence suggested Inga had been harmed, held, or hidden. A local hunter reported hearing a child scream that evening in the forest. Search dogs were immediately deployed to that location. They found no scent, no evidence of disturbance, no indication that Inga had been at that spot. But there was one witness report that would become significant years later. Someone reported seeing a white van driving away down a narrow lane around the time of Inga's disappearance. At the time, it seemed like one detail among thousands. Later, when investigators turned their attention to a suspect who owned a white van modified with hidden compartments, that detail would take on new meaning. In the immediate aftermath, investigators pursued every lead aggressively. The 30-person special unit worked around the clock. More than 100 people from Wilhelmshof were questioned, some multiple times. Background checks were run on staff members, residents, and anyone who had been on the property that day. The facility's open access policy complicated matters enormously. With 90-plus people present that Saturday, tracking everyone's movements became nearly impossible. Some residents had cognitive impairments that made interviews challenging. Some visitors had left before Inga was reported missing. Some patients' relatives had been there briefly with their children before departing. The proximity of the Ursprüngliche Forensic Psychiatry Center raised immediate questions. Could a patient have escaped? Could someone with access to that facility have been involved? Investigators checked those possibilities thoroughly. No escapes were reported. No patients were missing. But the knowledge that convicted sex offenders were housed just 3 to 4 kilometers away created an atmosphere of dread. The investigation generated hundreds of tips in the first weeks. People reported suspicious vehicles, strangers seen near Wilhelmshof, individuals acting oddly in the area. Every tip was followed up. None led to Inga. The case began to take on the characteristics that would define it for the next decade. Massive effort, exhaustive searches, countless leads, and absolutely no concrete answers. To her family, Inga was simply their youngest child, the baby of the family at 5 years old. She had 3 older siblings who doted on her. She was at that age where missing front teeth made her smile distinctive, where carrying water bottles to help at a barbecue felt like an important grown-up task. Victoria Gehricke later described the ordinariness of that day, how nothing had seemed wrong or dangerous about visiting friends at Wilhelmshof. It was a place they'd been before, a place that felt safe. A community facility operated by a Christian charity dedicated to helping people with disabilities and addiction issues, the kind of place that should have been secure. But as investigators dug deeper into Wilhelmshof itself, questions began to emerge. With open public access and dozens of people on the grounds that day, how secure was it really? Could someone have been watching the children? Could someone have been waiting for an opportunity? That 100-meter footpath became the focus of endless analysis. How could a child vanish from such a short distance? Between adults at both ends, in broad daylight? The timeline was brutally short. Yen Zue saw Inga at approximately 6:30. 2 other children saw her walking back toward the house. Victoria noticed her missing at approximately 6:45. 15 minutes. Maybe less. In that window, Inga Gehricke ceased to exist in any way that left physical evidence. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded beyond Wilhelmshof and the immediate forest. Investigators began looking at registered sex offenders in the region. Background checks were run on anyone with a history of crimes against children. The white van sighting led to efforts to identify every white van in the area on May 2nd. Search teams returned to the forest repeatedly, sometimes with fresh eyes, sometimes with new technology. Ground-penetrating radar was used to check for disturbed earth that might indicate a burial site. Nothing. Cadaver dogs trained specifically to detect human remains searched areas the tracking dogs had covered before. Nothing. The media coverage intensified. Inga's photo appeared on German news broadcasts, in newspapers, on missing person websites. Her distinctive gap-toothed smile, her blonde plaits with yellow hair ties, her blue eyes. The case was compared immediately to another missing child case that had captivated Europe years earlier. The media began calling Inga Germany's Maddie, referring to 3-year-old Madeleine McCann, who had disappeared from a Portuguese tourist resort on May 3, 2007. The parallels were striking and disturbing. Madeleine vanished on May 3, 2007. Inga vanished on May 2, 2015. Almost exactly 8 years apart. Both in early May. Both were blonde, blue-eyed, fair-skinned young girls. Both disappeared during family gatherings without a trace. Both cases generated massive search operations and international attention. Both investigations would struggle for years without finding definitive answers. But there were also key differences. Madeleine disappeared from a tourist resort in Portugal, a place filled with transient visitors and tourists. Inga vanished from an isolated German charity facility, a place with a more stable population. The McCann case attracted vastly more international attention and resources, becoming one of the most famous missing child cases in modern history. Inga's case remained primarily a German investigation. Yet, the comparison persisted, partly because of the similarities, partly because of the equally baffling lack of evidence in both cases. And later, when investigators began looking at a suspect who would be named in connection with Madeleine McCann, that comparison would take on even more significance. As 2015 progressed, the intensive search phase gave way to a longer investigative process. Tips continued to come in, but fewer and fewer. The special 30-person unit continued working the case, but other investigations demanded resources. The Gehricke family returned to their home in Schönebeck, trying to maintain some normalcy for their 3 other children while living with the nightmare of not knowing what happened to their youngest. Victoria Gehricke avoided returning to Wilhelmshof. She later described it as that terrible place, saying she'd only been back 2 or 3 times in the years since. For her, the facility was forever linked to the worst day of her life, the place where she'd been buttering bread rolls for a barbecue while her daughter disappeared. Inga Gehricke expressed something that would characterize the family's relationship with Wilhelmshof for years. I still have this mistrust in the Wilhelmshof and its inhabitants to this day. This feeling that something is off there has never left me. Whether that feeling reflected genuine suspicion of someone at the facility or simply the trauma of losing his daughter in that location, it spoke to the enduring questions about what happened on those grounds. The investigation generated over 2,000 tips in the first year alone. Every single one was followed up. Investigators tracked down reported sightings of children matching Inga's description across Germany. They investigated reports of suspicious behavior, strange vehicles, possible abduction attempts. None led to Inga. Missing child cases inflict a unique kind of torture on families. When a loved one dies, there's grief but also closure. When a child vanishes without a trace, families are suspended in a nightmare of not knowing. Is she alive? Is she being held somewhere? Is she being harmed? Did she die quickly or suffer? Will she ever come home? Victoria Gehricke told Stern magazine in 2017, "My feeling tells me that she is still alive. We have to hope that where she is, she's doing reasonably well." That statement captured the desperate hope that many families of missing children cling to even as years pass. The alternative, accepting that Inga might be dead, was unbearable. But Jensuve's perspective had already darkened by that point. "I still have the hope that she will be found. But the hope that she will come back alive goes to zero for me." The divergent perspectives of Inga's parents would become another casualty of her disappearance. The strain of living with this uncertainty, of maintaining hope or accepting the worst, would eventually contribute to Victoria and Jensuve's separation. The 3 older Gehricke children reportedly believed something different. According to family statements, the siblings believed Inga is living in a family again. Whether this was genuine hope or a coping mechanism, it reflected the human need to construct a narrative that offered some comfort, even if that narrative might not reflect reality. German television played a major role in keeping Inga's case in the public consciousness. The case was featured on Aktenzeichen XY Ungelöst, Germany's equivalent of America's Most Wanted or Crime Stoppers, multiple times. The ZDF program generated hundreds of tips each time it aired Inga's case. MDR Television's Kripo Live also featured the investigation repeatedly. These broadcasts showed Inga's photo, detailed the circumstances of her disappearance, and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The reward offered by Saxony-Anhalt police grew over time, eventually reaching €25,000, the highest ever offered by that police force. But despite the media attention, despite the reward, despite the thousands of tips, no breakthrough came. The case remained as mysterious in 2016 as it had been in the immediate aftermath of Inga's disappearance. Investigators had theories but no proof, suspects but no evidence, leads but no answers. In February 2016, investigators received intelligence that would shift the entire investigation. Information had surfaced about a man living at a derelict box factory in New Wegersleben, a location roughly 50 to 90 kilometers from Wilhelmshof. His name was Christian Brückner. More than 100 police officers descended on the New Wegersleben property. They spent hours digging holes across the site. They searched every building. They examined vehicles. They were looking for evidence connecting Brückner to Inga Gehricke's disappearance. What they found was disturbing but not immediately connected to Inga. Buried under Brückner's dead dog, investigators discovered a USB stick containing more than 8,000 child abuse images. In his mobile home, they found children's swimwear. The discoveries were enough to prosecute Brückner for possession of child exploitation material, but they didn't definitively link him to Inga's disappearance. The investigation into Christian Brückner's potential involvement in Inga's case lasted just 4 weeks before it was closed. That decision would later be heavily criticized by the Gehricke family's lawyers, but at the time, investigators made a determination. Brückner wasn't their man. To understand why Brückner became a suspect and why his case would later become internationally significant, you need to understand his criminal history. Christian Brückner was born in December 1976 in Würzburg, Germany. His criminal record began in adolescence and stretched across decades. He'd been convicted of sexual abuse of a child in 1994 at age 17. He'd been convicted of drug offenses. He'd lived transient lifestyles across Germany and Portugal. He was known to police as a drifter, someone who moved frequently, worked odd jobs, and operated on the margins of society. In 2005, in Praia da Luz, Portugal, Brückner raped a 72-year-old American woman in her own apartment. That crime wouldn't be connected to him until years later, but it would eventually send him to prison for 7 years. And Praia da Luz would become significant for another reason entirely. On May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann disappeared from her family's holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, while her parents dined at a nearby restaurant. That case became one of the most famous missing child investigations in modern history, generating international headlines for over a decade. Christian Brückner had been living in Praia da Luz in 2007. He'd been living there in 2005 when he committed the rape. When German and Portuguese investigators eventually made those connections years later, Brückner would become the prime suspect in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. But in February 2016, when German police searched his property in connection with Inga Gehricke's case, none of that was public knowledge yet. Investigators were looking at Brückner purely because of circumstantial factors connecting him to the Inga case. The reasons Christian Brückner attracted investigative attention in Inga's case were compelling, even if ultimately insufficient. First, proximity. Brückner lived at that derelict box factory in Nieuw-Wegersleben, approximately 50 to 90 kilometers from Wilhelmshof depending on the route. That placed him within striking distance of where Inga disappeared. Second, timing. On May 1, 2015, the day before Inga vanished, Brückner had been involved in a traffic accident at a motorway service station near Helmstedt. That placed him in the general region at exactly the relevant time. He was definitively in the area just 24 hours before a 5-year-old girl vanished. Third, the vehicle. Between 2013 and 2016, Brückner owned a white Mercedes Sprinter van. That van had been modified with 2 hidden compartments. One built into the wall, one built into the floor. Those compartments were clearly designed to conceal something, and witnesses had reported seeing a white van leaving the Wilhelmshof area around the time Inga disappeared. Fourth, alibi or lack thereof. Brückner had no verified alibi for May 2, 2015. He couldn't prove where he'd been that evening. He couldn't definitively rule himself out. And given his history of crimes against children, that absence of an alibi made him a legitimate person of interest. The February 2016 search of his property had produced evidence of child sexual abuse material, reinforcing concerns about his potential involvement. Everything circumstantial pointed toward Brückner being worth extensive investigation. But circumstantial evidence doesn't solve cases. And ultimately, investigators found something that effectively cleared him. Modern missing persons investigations rely heavily on digital evidence, and few pieces of digital evidence are more definitive than cell phone location data. When your mobile phone is turned on, it continuously communicates with cell towers, creating a record of your approximate location. That data can be subpoenaed and analyzed to determine where someone was at a specific time. Prosecutor Thomas Kramer reviewed Christian Brückner's cell phone records for May 2, 2015. The records showed that Brückner's mobile phone had not been logged into the cell tower coverage area around Wilhelmshof on the evening of Inga's disappearance. His phone was elsewhere. That meant, barring the possibility that he deliberately left his phone somewhere else, Brückner himself was elsewhere. Cell phone evidence isn't perfect. Someone could theoretically leave their phone at home while committing a crime. But that requires premeditation, knowledge that police would check phone records, and a deliberate effort to create a false alibi. Given that Inga's disappearance was opportunistic, happening during a random family barbecue, it seemed unlikely Brückner would have engineered such an elaborate setup. Based on the cell phone records, Prosecutor Kramer stated that Brückner was effectively ruled out. The investigation into his potential involvement in Inga's case was closed after just 4 weeks. The family's attorney, Stefan Schappi, would later maintain that investigators should have probed more thoroughly, but the cell phone data was considered definitive at the time. With Brückner ruled out, investigators returned to pursuing other leads. Tips continued to arrive, though at a slower pace than in the immediate aftermath of Inga's disappearance. The Special Investigative Unit continued reviewing thousands of pages of witness statements, analyzing the timeline, searching for any detail that might have been overlooked. The GPS tracking data from the search dogs continued to puzzle investigators. The trail 50 kilometers away, near the A2 Autobahn, suggested vehicle transport. But if Brückner and his white van weren't involved, then whose vehicle had been used? The witness who'd seen a white van leaving Wilhelmshof around the time of Inga's disappearance couldn't provide detailed enough information to identify the specific vehicle or driver. Investigators expanded their search to registered sex offenders across the region. Background checks were run on anyone within a 100-kilometer radius, with convictions for crimes against children. Alibis were verified. Phone records were checked. Vehicle registrations were examined. The investigation was methodical and exhaustive, but it wasn't producing the breakthrough everyone desperately wanted. In July 2016, another case sent shockwaves through Germany. A man named Silvio S., known publicly as Silvio Schulz, was convicted of murdering 2 children and received a life sentence. The brutality of those crimes and Schulz's history immediately made him a person of interest in Inga's case. Investigators thoroughly reviewed Schulz's movements and activities on May 2, 2015. They checked his location, his vehicle, his communications. They interrogated him about Inga's disappearance. But, ultimately, they determined that Silvio Schulz had a cast-iron alibi for May 2nd. He could definitively prove where he'd been that evening, and it wasn't anywhere near Wilhelmshof. He was ruled out entirely. The pattern was becoming frustrating and familiar. Suspects who seemed promising based on their criminal histories would be investigated, only to be cleared through alibi verification or lack of physical evidence. The investigation was professional and thorough, but thoroughness without results doesn't bring a missing child home. By 2017, 2 years after Inga's disappearance, the case had taken on the characteristics of a long-term mystery. The Gehricke family participated in media interviews, partly to keep attention on the case, partly as a form of catharsis, partly because speaking publicly felt like the only thing they could do. Victoria Gehricke's interview with Stern magazine revealed both her enduring hope and her profound trauma. "My feeling tells me that she is still alive," she said. "We have to hope that where she is, she's doing reasonably well." That statement reflected a mother's need to believe her child might still be alive somewhere, even if that belief wasn't necessarily supported by evidence. She also revealed the psychological impact of Wilhelmshof itself, that terrible place. "I've only been back 2 or 3 times. The facility where Inga disappeared had become a location Victoria couldn't bear to visit, forever associated with the worst moment of her life." Jens Uwe's perspective had darkened considerably. "I still have the hope that she will be found, but the hope that she will come back alive goes to 0 for me." His statement reflected a more resigned acceptance of the likely outcome. After 2 years without a trace, without evidence of Inga being alive, without ransom demands or sightings, statistical reality suggested the worst. The divergence in Victoria and Jens Uwe's perspectives on Inga's fate would contribute to increasing strain in their marriage. Living with the trauma of a missing child is difficult enough. Living with fundamentally different beliefs about what happened to that child makes it nearly impossible to grieve or heal together. From 2017 through 2019, the investigation entered what might be called its second phase. The massive search operations had concluded. The immediate questioning of dozens of witnesses had been completed. The case was no longer generating daily headlines, but investigators continued working, pursuing leads that continued to trickle in. The dedicated website www.inga-suche.de received hundreds of messages from people across Germany who thought they might have seen Inga or had information about the case. Every message was reviewed. Credible leads were investigated. Most led nowhere, but investigators couldn't afford to dismiss anything. The case file grew to over 150 volumes of documentation. Every witness statement, every search operation report, every tip that had been followed up, every dead end that had been explored. The accumulated paperwork represented thousands of hours of investigative work without producing the one thing that mattered: finding Inga. During this period, another suspect emerged, who would generate significant controversy due to how his case was handled. Martin H., a convicted pedophile approximately 35 to 41 years old from near Stendal, attracted investigative attention after disturbing discoveries at properties connected to him. Near Dessau, an abandoned house was found that had been modified in deeply unsettling ways. The windows had been bricked up from the inside. Soundproof doors had been installed. The house had a basement accessible only through a 40-centimeter by 40-centimeter hatch, essentially a crawlspace entrance. Inside that basement were multiple mattresses and bondage equipment. The setup suggested a location designed for captivity. Martin H. Berlin apartment revealed another disturbing element. When searched, investigators found child-sized sex dolls that reportedly resembled Inga. The level of premeditation and depravity suggested by these discoveries made Martin H. a compelling suspect in a case involving a missing 5-year-old girl. The investigative file on Martin H. grew to 1,900 pages. 1,900 pages of evidence, witness statements, background checks, and analysis connecting him to suspicious activities. Despite this extensive documentation, police investigated Martin H. for only 11 days in 2019 before stopping. What happened next would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire Inga Gehricke investigation. According to reports that would emerge years later, those 1,900 pages of investigation files on Martin H. simply disappeared. The extensive documentation connecting him to suspicious locations and activities, the evidence of his background as a convicted pedophile, the analysis of his potential involvement in Inga's case, all of it vanished from the investigative record. The family's lawyer criticized authorities for not pursuing the Martin H. lead more aggressively. 11 days of active investigation for a suspect with that profile, with those discoveries at his properties, seemed grossly insufficient. But without the case file, without the documentation that had been compiled, there was no way to reconstruct what leads might have been missed or what connections might have been overlooked. The disappearance of 1,900 pages of investigation files raised troubling questions about the competence and integrity of the investigation. Had the files been genuinely lost through administrative error? Had someone deliberately removed them? Were there elements in those files that implicated someone investigators didn't want implicated? The missing documentation would become a focal point for criticism of how the case had been handled. As the case approached its 5th anniversary in May 2019, the investigation had largely stalled. New leads had dried up almost completely. The major suspects who'd been identified had either been ruled out through alibis and phone records or investigated briefly before those investigations were closed without charges. The Gehricke family marked another grim milestone, another year without answers. Victoria and Jens Uwe's marriage had deteriorated under the strain. Their 3 older children were growing up with the trauma of their sister's disappearance. The family that had driven to Wilhelmshof for a simple barbecue in 2015 no longer existed in the same form. Media coverage had decreased significantly. Inga's case was no longer generating daily or even weekly headlines. The public's attention had moved on to other tragedies, other mysteries. But for the Gehricke family and for the investigators still working the case, nothing had moved on. They remained trapped in that 15-minute window on May 2, 2015. Then, in June 2020, something happened that would thrust Inga's case back into international headlines. Something that would cause investigators to reopen aspects of the case they thought had been definitively resolved. Something that would link a missing 5-year-old girl from Eastern Germany to a missing 3-year-old British girl from Portugal 13 years earlier. On June 3, 2020, German prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters held a press conference that shocked the world. He announced that German authorities had identified a prime suspect in the 2007 disappearance of Madeleine McCann from Praia da Luz, Portugal. That suspect was a German national, currently in prison for other crimes. His name was Christian Brückner. The announcement sent journalists scrambling to piece together Brückner's history. The 43-year-old convicted rapist and pedophile had been living in Portugal's Algarve region between 1995 and 2007. He'd been in Praia da Luz, specifically when Madeleine McCann disappeared on May 3, 2007. He'd been living in a camper van near the resort where the McCann family was staying. Prosecutor Wolters stated that German authorities believed Madeleine was dead and that Brückner had killed her, though they didn't have enough evidence yet to charge him. The announcement generated massive international media coverage, bringing the Madeleine McCann case back into global headlines after years of reduced attention. But for investigators working the Inga Gehricke case, the announcement had another implication entirely. Christian Brückner had been investigated and ruled out in Inga's disappearance in 2016. But that investigation had lasted only 4 weeks. Had it been thorough enough? Had investigators missed something? Should the case be reopened? The revelation that Christian Brückner was now the prime suspect in one of the world's most famous missing child cases forced German investigators to reconsider everything about their earlier assessment of his potential involvement in Inga's disappearance. The circumstantial connections were still there. His proximity to Wilhelmshof, his presence in the region on May 1st, his white van with hidden compartments, his lack of alibi, but there was still that cell phone evidence. The records showing his mobile phone wasn't in the Wilhelmshof area on May 2, 2015. That evidence hadn't changed. If anything, it had become more definitive with time as the technology and analysis improved. Brückner's phone was elsewhere when Inga vanished. However, the family's attorney, Stefan Tschappe, argued publicly that investigators should probe more thoroughly, regardless of the cell phone records. Brückner's confirmed involvement in the Praia da Luz area when Madeleine McCann disappeared meant he should be considered capable of exactly the kind of opportunistic abduction that seemed to have occurred at Wilhelmshof. In April 2024, 4 years after Brückner was named in the Madeleine McCann case, German police made a significant move regarding the Inga investigation. They seized Brückner's former white Mercedes Sprinter van from its current owner to test for DNA evidence. The van had passed through multiple owners since Brückner sold it in 2016. That meant any evidence that might have existed inside had potentially been contaminated by years of use by other people. But forensic technology had advanced considerably, and investigators believed there might still be trace DNA that could link the van to Inga, or potentially to other missing children. The seizure of the van represented one of the most significant forensic efforts in the Inga case in years. If investigators could find Inga's DNA in that van, it would definitively prove Brückner had been involved, regardless of what his cell phone records showed. He could have left his phone elsewhere deliberately to create a false alibi. The DNA evidence would trump the cell phone evidence. The results of that DNA testing have never been publicly disclosed. That silence suggests one of two possibilities. Either no DNA evidence was found, or DNA evidence was found but investigators are keeping it confidential as part of an ongoing investigation. The lack of charges against Brückner and Inga's case suggests the former is more likely, but the continued silence leaves the question unresolved. While the DNA testing of the van proceeded in secret, Christian Brückner faced public criminal proceedings in Germany for offenses completely separate from either the Madeleine McCann or Inga Gehricke cases. In October 2024, he stood trial accused of 5 separate sex crimes committed in Portugal between 2000 and 2017. The charges included 3 rapes and 2 sexual assaults. Prosecutors presented evidence and witness testimony attempting to establish Brückner's guilt, but ultimately, the trial concluded with full acquittal. The court determined there was insufficient evidence to convict him on any of the charges. The verdict was controversial, with some observers believing the prosecution's case had been weak, others suspecting witness issues or evidentiary problems had undermined what might have been valid charges. The acquittal didn't mean Brückner went free. He remained in prison serving a 7-year sentence for the 2005 rape of a 72-year-old American woman in Praia da Luz. That rape had been definitively proven through DNA evidence and witness testimony. He'd been convicted of that crime separately, and the sentence kept him behind bars even as the other charges fell apart. But on September 17, 2025, Christian Brückner completed that sentence and was released from prison. He didn't walk away completely free. German authorities fitted him with an electronic ankle tag that would monitor his location continuously for 5 years. The monitoring represented a compromise. He couldn't be held indefinitely without charges, but authorities wanted the ability to track his movements, given his criminal history and his status as a suspect in multiple missing person cases. Scene 2. The cell phone evidence examined. To understand why Christian Brückner remained ruled out in Inga's case despite his connection to Madeleine McCann, it's essential to understand exactly what the cell phone evidence showed and why prosecutors considered it definitive. On May 2, 2015, between 6:30 and 8:15, Brückner's mobile phone communicated with cell towers that were not in the Wilhelmshof area. Cell phone tower records show which towers a phone connects to as it moves or remains stationary. The specific towers Brückner's phone connected with during those crucial hours were too far from Wilhelmshof for him to have been physically present at the facility. Could someone have taken Brückner's phone elsewhere while he committed the crime? Theoretically, yes, but that scenario requires believing that Brückner either worked with an accomplice who deliberately took his phone to create an alibi, or that he planned an opportunistic child abduction so carefully that he left his phone elsewhere in advance. Neither scenario fits the facts of Inga's disappearance, which happened during a random family barbecue that couldn't have been predicted. Could Brückner have turned off his phone? Cell phone records would show when a phone is turned off and turned back on. There's no indication in the records of Brückner's phone being off during the relevant time frame. The phone was active, communicating with towers, just not the right towers. The cell phone evidence, in the assessment of prosecutor Thomas Kramer and the investigative team, effectively cleared Brückner of involvement in Inga's disappearance. That assessment has remained consistent, even as scrutiny of the case has intensified following the Madeleine McCann revelations. Scene 3. The facility itself comes under scrutiny. As years passed, without external suspects producing results, attention increasingly turned back to Wilhelmshof itself. Could someone at the facility have been involved? Could a resident, staff member, or visitor have abducted Inga? The logistics favored an insider to some degree, Someone at the facility would have known the property layout intimately. They would have known where children played, where adults gathered, where blind spots existed. They would have understood the timing of activities, the movements of staff and residents, the locations of vehicles and buildings. The 15-minute window also suggested either extremely good timing or insider knowledge. An external abductor would have needed to be watching, waiting for precisely the right moment when Inga was alone on that 100-meter footpath. An insider would have potentially known that the barbecue preparation would create exactly that opportunity. But investigating residents and staff at a facility housing 85 people with disabilities and 24 addiction recovery patients presented unique challenges. Some residents had cognitive impairments that made interviews difficult or unreliable. Some had conditions that might cause confusion about timelines or events. Building a case against someone in that population would require extremely solid evidence given the potential for reasonable doubt about their mental state. Scene 4. Jens Uwe's lingering suspicions. Inga's father, Jens Uwe Gehricke, never lost his sense that something was wrong with Wilhelmshof itself. "I still have this mistrust in the Wilhelmshof and its inhabitants to this day," he said in interviews. "This feeling that something is off there has never left me." Whether that mistrust reflected genuine suspicion based on something he observed that day, or simply the trauma of losing his daughter in that location, it represented a persistent thread in the family's relationship with the investigation. Jens Uwe wanted investigators to focus more heavily on people who'd been at the facility that day, to interrogate them more aggressively, to pursue leads connected to Wilhelmshof itself rather than external suspects. But without specific evidence pointing to a specific individual at the facility, investigators couldn't justify more invasive investigations of residents or staff. Background checks had been run on everyone. Interviews had been conducted extensively in the immediate aftermath. Phone records had been checked where applicable. No smoking gun emerged. The challenge investigators faced was that suspicion isn't evidence. A feeling that something was wrong at Wilhelmshof didn't identify who might have been involved or provide grounds for charges. And with approximately 90 people present at the facility that day, the pool of potential suspects was both large enough to be overwhelming and diffuse enough that no individual stood out as clearly suspicious. Scene 5. The strain on the family. Victoria and Jens Uwe Gehricke's marriage did not survive the trauma of Inga's disappearance. The couple eventually separated, unable to maintain their relationship under the weight of grief, uncertainty, and fundamentally different perspectives on what had happened to their daughter and whether she might still be alive. Divorce or separation is tragically common among parents of missing or murdered children. The statistics are sobering. Studies suggest that over 70% of couples who lose a child to death or abduction eventually separate or divorce. The reasons are complex, but include divergent grief responses, blame and guilt dynamics, inability to communicate about the loss, and the simple fact that each parent becomes a constant reminder to the other of the worst day of their lives. Victoria maintained hope that Inga was alive somewhere. Jens Uwe had largely accepted that she was probably dead. Those incompatible beliefs made it nearly impossible to grieve together or support each other. Every conversation about Inga became a reminder of their different perspectives. Every anniversary of her disappearance, every media interview, every new lead that went nowhere reinforced the divide between them. Their 3 older children, Maxim, Julius, and Freya, had to navigate adolescence and young adulthood with the trauma of their sister's disappearance and their parents' separation. According to family statements, the siblings believed Inga is living in a family again, a belief that might have represented genuine hope or a psychological coping mechanism to deal with uncertainty. Scene 6. April-May 2023. Transfer to Cold Case Unit. By 2023, the investigation had been ongoing for 8 years without a resolution. The case had gone through periods of intense activity, followed by relative quiet. Leads had been pursued exhaustively without producing charges. Multiple suspects had been investigated and ruled out. The investigation had generated enormous documentation but no answers. In April and May 2023, following years of criticism about investigation failures, Interior Minister Tamara Zia Shang made an announcement that represented both an admission of problems and a commitment to a fresh approach. The Inga Gehricke case would be transferred from the Polizei Inspection Stendal, which had led the investigation since 2015, to a specialized cold case unit in Halle, specifically the city of Halle and Der Saale in Saxony-Anhalt. Cold case units operate differently from active investigation teams. They bring fresh eyes to old evidence. They use advances in forensic technology that didn't exist when crimes were first investigated. They systematically re-examine assumptions and conclusions that earlier investigators might have taken for granted, and they're not burdened by the institutional inertia or potential biases that can develop when the same team works a case for years without resolution. The Halley Cold Case Unit assigned 8 investigators to systematically review the entire Inga Gehricke case file. That file had grown to over 150 volumes, more than 40,000 pages of documentation. Every witness statement would be re-examined. Every lead would be reassessed. Every decision made during the original investigation would be scrutinized. Scene 7. Digitization and systematic review. One of the first major tasks the Cold Case Unit undertook was complete digitization of the case file. Over 40,000 pages were scanned, indexed, and entered into searchable databases. This might seem like routine administrative work, but it's actually crucial for modern investigations. Physical files are difficult to search comprehensively. An investigator, looking for all references to a particular vehicle or witness or location, has to manually page through volumes of documents, risking missed connections. Digital files can be searched instantly. Cross-referencing becomes possible. Patterns that might not have been visible across hundreds of pages of physical documents can emerge when data is analyzed systematically. The digitization also ensured that the case file couldn't be lost, damaged, or have portions go missing the way the Martin H. file allegedly had. Digital backups meant that even if physical documents were destroyed or disappeared, the information they contained would remain accessible. The Cold Case Unit investigators began working through the 4,000-plus leads that had been generated over 8 years. Each lead had been followed up initially, but the question was whether earlier investigators might have dismissed something that deserved more attention, or whether new information had emerged since 2015 that cast old leads in a different light. Scene 8. December 2023. False alarm at Uch Spring. In December 2023, a development occurred that briefly raised hopes for a breakthrough. Private search dogs, trained specifically for human remains detection, were brought in to search areas around Wilhelmshof that had been covered multiple times before. These dogs operate differently from tracking dogs. Instead of following a scent trail, they alert when they detect the chemical signatures of decomposition. On former military land near Uch Spring, just kilometers from where Inga had vanished, the cadaver dogs alerted at a specific location. Their behavior indicated they were detecting something beneath the surface. Given the dogs' training and reliability record, investigators took the alert seriously. On December 14, 2023, police conducted an excavation at the site. Heavy equipment was brought in. The area was carefully dug up under controlled conditions to preserve any evidence that might be present. As excavation progressed, officers recovered small bones from the soil. The bones were immediately sent for forensic analysis. For a brief period, there was hope and dread that after more than 8 years, Inga's remains might finally have been found. But forensic examination determined definitively that the bones were animal remains, not human. The cadaver dogs had detected decomposition, but not human decomposition. The alert had been a false positive. Scene 9. 2024. Renewed searches. The year 2024 saw multiple search operations conducted by the Cold Case Unit as they worked through their systematic review. In March, more than 60 officers deployed to the forest areas around Wilhelmshof. The searches used updated technology, including more advanced thermal imaging equipment and ground-penetrating radar that had improved since the original searches in 2015. The March searches focused on areas that hadn't been covered as extensively in the first wave 8 years earlier. Forest undergrowth changes over time. Areas that were dense and difficult to search in 2015 might be more accessible in 2024. Ground-penetrating radar technology can detect anomalies beneath the surface that might indicate disturbed earth or buried objects. In October 2024, divers were deployed to search a heavily silted pond 2 to 3 kilometers from where Inga had vanished. The pond hadn't been searched in the original investigation, either because it was considered too distant or because it hadn't been identified as a potential location at the time. Divers worked through difficult conditions in murky water with limited visibility, searching by feel as much as by sight. Neither the March ground searches nor the October dive produced new evidence. No clothing, no remains, no personal effects belonging to Inga were discovered. The pattern established in 2015 continued. Exhaustive searches covering enormous areas found nothing. Scene 10. November 2024. The Smoothie Bottle Campaign. In November 2024, one of the most innovative public awareness campaigns in German missing person history, launched. True Fruits, a German smoothie company known for provocative marketing, partnered with police to create a unique approach to keeping Inga's case in public consciousness. The company printed Inga's childhood photo, the one showing her gap-toothed smile and blonde plaits, on over 30,000 smoothie bottles. Alongside the childhood photo, they placed a new age progression image, showing how Inga might look at age 15. The bottles were distributed across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland to supermarkets and retail locations. The campaign was brilliantly designed for maximum impact. Instead of a poster that people might glance at once, these bottles were picked up by consumers, held while waiting in checkout lines, taken home, and kept in refrigerators for days. Each bottle included information about the case, the reward amount, and how to contact police with tips. The campaign generated over 40 new tips in its first weeks. Whether any of those tips will lead to a breakthrough remains to be seen. But the surge in public attention was exactly what investigators hoped for. Cold cases often break when someone who had information years earlier finally decides to come forward, whether due to changed circumstances, guilty conscience, or renewed public attention reminding them of what they witnessed. True Fruits also contributed €25,000 to double the existing police reward, bringing the total to €50,000. That's the highest reward ever offered by Saxony-Anhalt police, reflecting both the severity of the case and the hope that financial incentive might motivate someone with information to finally speak up. €50,000 represents a substantial sum, enough to change someone's life circumstances significantly. The psychological calculation investigators make with rewards is that someone who might have been reluctant to come forward out of fear, loyalty, or simply not wanting to get involved might be motivated to do so if there's significant financial benefit. Rewards are particularly useful in cases where investigators suspect someone knows something but hasn't spoken up. That could be a person who saw something suspicious but didn't realize its significance at the time. It could be someone who overheard a conversation or noticed behavioral changes in someone they know. It could even be an accomplice who helped after the fact and has carried guilt for years. The doubling of the reward, from €25,000 to €50,000 in 2024, signals that investigators believe someone out there has information. They believe that given sufficient incentive, that person might finally provide the crucial detail that could break the case open. Whether that belief is justified won't be known unless and until someone comes forward with actionable information. As the 10th anniversary of Inga's disappearance approached in early 2025, the Cold Case Unit conducted fresh searches in February and March. More than 50 officers deployed to woodland between Uxspring and Wilhelmshof, using thermal imaging drones to search from the air. The technology had advanced considerably since 2015. Modern thermal drones can detect heat signatures through forest canopy and identify anomalies in ground temperature that might indicate disturbed earth or decomposing organic material. The drones covered areas that would take ground search teams days or weeks to search on foot. The searches focused specifically on looking for decomposed clothing or human remains. After nearly 10 years, investigators had to assume that if Inga's body was in the forest, it would be largely skeletal. Clothing would have degraded but might still be visible, particularly synthetic materials like the nylon or polyester components of her pink shoes or the elastic in her hair ties. Nothing was found. The forest, which had been searched 14 separate times over 10 years using every available technology and method, continued to yield no evidence of what happened to Inga Gehricke. May 2, 2025, marked exactly 10 years since Inga Gehricke vanished. A decade had passed since that 15-minute window when a 5-year-old girl walked down a 100-meter footpath carrying water bottles and never arrived at her destination. If alive, Inga would now be 15 years old, no longer the small child with missing front teeth and yellow hair ties, but a teenager. The age progression image, created for the True Fruits campaign, showed a young woman with longer blonde hair, mature facial features, but still recognizably the same blue eyes that stared out from that 2015 photo. The progression suggested who Inga might be, might look like, might have become. But without evidence that she survived her disappearance, the image represented hope more than probability. For Victoria Gehricke, the 10th anniversary brought renewed media attention and renewed pain. "The terrible uncertainty is the worst, regardless of the date," she told reporters. That uncertainty, that not knowing, remained the defining characteristic of her life 10 years later. Not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead, not knowing if she'd suffered or died quickly, not knowing if she'd ever learn the truth. Jens Uwe Gehricke's perspective remained grimmer. His hope that Inga would be found remained, but his hope that she'd be found alive had essentially disappeared. 10 years was too long. The statistics on missing children were too clear. When a child vanishes and isn't found within hours or days, the likelihood of recovery alive drops precipitously. After a decade, the chances approach zero. On the 10th anniversary, MDR Television aired a major investigative documentary that would rock the case to its foundations. The documentary team had spent 18 months conducting their own review of the 40,000-page case file, interviewing investigators, experts, and family members, and uncovering details about the investigation that had never been made public before. The bombshell revelation involved the investigation's integrity at a fundamental level. In 2016, police had commissioned a psychologist to analyze the case, examine the evidence, and provide professional assessment of what might have happened to Inga. That psychologist's analysis had informed investigative decisions and priorities. What the MDR investigation revealed was that the psychologist commissioned for this work was already in a romantic relationship with the lead investigator on the case at the time she was hired. They weren't just colleagues. They were romantically involved while she was supposedly providing independent expert analysis. They are now married. The family's lawyer, Stefan Tizschapa, questioned the independence and reliability of that psychological analysis given the relationship. How objective could an expert assessment be when the expert was personally involved with the person leading the investigation she was supposed to be evaluating? Did the relationship influence what she analyzed, what conclusions she drew, what recommendations she made? The revelation about the psychologist-investigator relationship raised broader questions about the investigation's handling from 2015 through 2023, before the case was transferred to the cold case unit. Were other aspects of the investigation compromised? Were leads not pursued because of relationships, biases, or institutional interests? The Martin H. case became even more troubling in light of these revelations. 1,900 pages of investigative file on a convicted pedophile with a dungeon at one property and child-sized sex dolls at another simply disappearing from the record seemed suspicious enough on its own. Combined with questions about the investigation's integrity, it raised the possibility of something more sinister than mere administrative incompetence. Had the Martin H. investigation been deliberately shut down? Had someone wanted to prevent that lead from being pursued? The 11 days of active investigation seemed absurdly short for a suspect with that profile. The missing files meant there was no way to reconstruct what leads might have been followed, what witnesses might have been interviewed, what evidence might have been collected. The MDR documentary presented these questions without claiming to have definitive answers, but the questions themselves were damaging enough. They suggested that the investigation into Inga's disappearance might have been compromised from its earliest stages, that leads might have been ignored or deliberately buried, that the truth might have been obscured by relationships and interests that had nothing to do with finding a missing child. The MDR documentary also introduced a new theoretical perspective on what might have happened to Inga. Professor Dirk Labuti of Hochschule Mittweida, a university in Saxony, had reviewed the case file and witness testimony with fresh eyes. Professor Labud suggested that Inga may have been approached by someone she went with willingly. His theory was based on witness testimony describing Inga as appearing unusually calm before she disappeared. If she'd been grabbed or forcibly taken, you'd expect signs of struggle, screaming, panic, but witnesses hadn't reported any disturbance. The theory posited that someone might have approached Inga on that footpath with a story that convinced her to go with them voluntarily. Maybe they told her they were looking for a lost dog and needed help searching. Maybe they told her one of the other children had gotten hurt and she needed to come quickly. Maybe they posed as a staff member, asking her to help with something. A 5-year-old child at a charity facility, surrounded by adults and staff members, might not have had strong stranger danger instincts in that environment. The facility was a place where many adults worked and resided. Inga might not have thought it was suspicious if someone she didn't recognize asked her to help with something or come with them somewhere. Professor Labuti emphasized that this remained speculation, not established fact. But he argued that the original psychological analysis had lacked proper crime scene reconstruction. The psychologist who'd analyzed the case in 2016, the one who was romantically involved with the lead investigator, hadn't conducted the kind of thorough situational analysis that might have explored this possibility. Crime scene reconstruction is a crucial element of serious criminal investigations. It involves systematically analyzing the physical environment where a crime occurred, the movements and positions of all individuals involved, the sequence of events, and the physical evidence that remains. In Inga's case, crime scene reconstruction was complicated by the fact that no crime scene was ever definitively identified. Was the crime scene the 100-meter footpath where she was last seen? Was it somewhere in the forest if she was taken there? Was it inside a vehicle if she was transported away? Was it a building on the Wilhelmshof property? The original investigation had conducted searches, but hadn't necessarily done the kind of detailed reconstruction that modern forensic standards would call for. This might have been because investigators initially believed Inga had simply gotten lost in the forest, making traditional crime scene reconstruction seem less relevant. By the time they'd concluded she'd been abducted, the scene had been contaminated by hundreds of searchers. Professor Laboudy's criticism was that the 2016 psychological analysis should have included systematic reconstruction of possible scenarios. If Inga went willingly with someone, what would that look like? What kind of approach would work on a 5-year-old in that environment? What would witnesses have seen or not seen? Where might she have been taken initially? The lack of this analysis meant that certain scenarios might never have been properly considered. Investigative resources might have been allocated based on assumptions that weren't thoroughly tested. Leads might have been dismissed that should have been pursued. Over the decades since Inga disappeared, 14 separate organized search operations had been conducted in the forest area around Wilhelmshof. That's an extraordinary commitment of resources, reflecting both the severity of the case and the determination to find answers. The searches had covered over 2,000 hectares repeatedly, using technology that included trained search dogs with GPS tracking in stand, police helicopters with thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar by, cadaver dogs trained for human remains detection, thermal imaging drones, systematic grid searches by ground teams. Some areas had been searched 4, 5, even 6 times as technology improved and seasons changed. Forest undergrowth that was impassable in summer might be more accessible in winter. Ground that was frozen in December might be easier to examine with ground-penetrating radar in July. Yet despite this extraordinary effort, despite searching an area equivalent to over 2,800 football fields multiple times, investigators had found nothing. No remains, no clothing, no personal effects, no evidence of where Inga had been taken or what had happened to her. One of the persistent theories investigators had to consider was that Inga's body was buried somewhere in those 4,700 hectares of woodland. If someone had abducted her from the footpath, taken her into the forest, killed her there or shortly after, and buried her remains, that would explain why 10 years of searches had found nothing. 4,700 hectares is an enormous area. That's over 47 square kilometers. Even with sophisticated technology and hundreds of searchers, finding a small burial site in that much woodland approaches impossibility unless you know roughly where to look. A body buried even half a meter deep becomes extremely difficult to detect. Ground-penetrating radar can identify disturbed earth, but forest ground is constantly being disturbed by animal activity, root growth, weather erosion. Cadaver dogs can detect decomposition through soil, but their effective range is limited and depends on wind direction, soil composition, and depth of burial. If someone familiar with the forest had buried Inga in a carefully chosen location, perhaps a place where natural features would mask disturbed earth, perhaps near a stream where erosion would seem natural, perhaps beneath an old fallen tree where digging would be less obvious, she might remain undiscovered for decades or forever. The alternative theory, supported by the scent dog findings 50 kilometers away near the Atu Autobahn, was that Inga had been transported by vehicle away from Wilhelmshof entirely. This theory suggested she wasn't in the forest at all, that she'd never been buried in those 4,700 hectares, that all the searches had been looking in the wrong place from the beginning. If someone had abducted Inga from the footpath, quickly placed her in a vehicle parked nearby, and driven away immediately, they could have been kilometers away before anyone even realized she was missing. By the time police arrived at 8:22 that evening, more than 2 hours after she'd vanished, a vehicle could have reached any location within 200 kilometers. The scent trail the dogs picked up toward Dresden suggested this possibility. But scent trails from vehicles are notoriously difficult to establish with certainty. The dogs might have been following residual scent particles that had been transferred to other locations through some other mechanism, or they might have been genuinely tracking Inga's scent from a vehicle, confirming that she'd been transported away. If the vehicle transport theory is correct, Inga could be buried anywhere in Germany or beyond. She could be in a grave 300 kilometers away, somewhere that would never be searched because there's no connection to the case. That possibility makes the search effectively impossible without specific intelligence about where she was taken. The white van sighting remained one of the few concrete details that investigators could work with. A witness had reported seeing a white van driving away down a narrow lane around the time Inga disappeared. That sighting led investigators to Christian Brückner, who owned a white Mercedes Sprinter van modified with hidden compartments. But Brückner had been ruled out through cell phone records. So if not his van, whose? The problem was that white vans are extremely common in Germany, used by tradespeople, delivery services, contractors, and countless other legitimate businesses. Trying to track down every white van that might have been in the area on May 2, 2015, was like trying to identify a specific drop of water in a lake. Investigators had attempted to work backward from the sighting. They'd tried to identify the witness who reported it, to get more detailed information about the van's make, model, any distinguishing features. They'd checked vehicle registrations for white vans owned by people connected to Wilhelmshof or living in the area. They'd looked for traffic camera footage, though the remote location meant cameras were sparse. None of those efforts produced a definitive lead to a specific vehicle. The white van remained a tantalizing clue that suggested vehicle transport, but couldn't be developed into actionable intelligence about whose vehicle or where it might have gone. If Inga Gehricke is alive somewhere, she would turn 16 on August 18, 2025. That means she'd have spent more than a decade, 2/3 of her entire life, away from her family. She'd have no clear memories of her parents, her siblings, her life before May 2, 2015. At 5 years old, childhood memories are fragmentary at best. The age progression images show a teenage girl who might be living anywhere, looking like any number of young women across Germany or Europe. Without distinctive features beyond general appearance, finding her would require either her coming forward herself, someone recognizing her and realizing who she is, or a break in the investigation that leads to wherever she's been held. The scenarios for how she could still be alive are all disturbing. She could have been abducted by someone who wanted to raise a child, though that scenario typically involves infants or toddlers, not 5-year-olds with established identities. She could be held captive somewhere, though holding someone for 10 years requires extraordinary circumstances and typically leaves some trace eventually. She could have been trafficked, taken to another country, given false documents, and a false identity. International child trafficking is a real phenomenon, though it typically involves children from regions with less robust police response than Germany. A blonde German girl generating international headlines might seem like a risky trafficking target, but stranger things have happened. The brutal statistical reality of missing child cases is that when children vanish and aren't found within the first 48 to 72 hours, the likelihood they'll be recovered alive drops dramatically. After a week, the chances are slim. After a month, they're remote. After a year, they approach zero. There are exceptions. Elizabeth Smart was recovered alive after 9 months. J.C. Dugard was found after 18 years. Natasha Kampusch escaped after 8 years. But these cases are remarkable precisely because they're so rare. For every child recovered alive after years, there are dozens or hundreds who never come home. Inga's case has now passed the 10-year mark. Statistically, the chance that she's alive is infinitesimally small. Inga Gehricke's assessment, that the hope that she will come back alive goes to zero for me, reflects this statistical reality. It's not pessimism so much as mathematical probability. Yet Victoria Gehricke maintains hope, and investigators continue working the case. Because until there's definitive proof that Inga is dead, until remains are found or someone confesses to killing her, there remains a possibility, however remote, that she could still be recovered. The 8 investigators assigned to the Inga Gehricke case in the Halle Cold Case Unit have been working systematically through the digitized 40,000-page case file for over 2 years. They've been following up on leads that may have been dismissed too quickly. They've been using advances in forensic technology that didn't exist in 2015. They've been conducting fresh searches with improved equipment. But they haven't produced a breakthrough yet. No new suspect has been identified. No new physical evidence has been found. No witness has come forward with information that changes the trajectory of the investigation. The case remains as mysterious as it was on May 2, 2015. The cold case unit's value isn't just in what they find, but in what they rule out definitively. Their systematic review has confirmed that certain lines of investigation were pursued appropriately. It's validated some of the original investigative work, while identifying areas where the investigation might have been compromised or insufficient. The revelation about the psychologist-investigator relationship came from the MDR documentary team's review, not from the cold case unit itself, suggesting that external scrutiny has been valuable in identifying potential problems. Whether the cold case unit will uncover additional issues, or whether they'll ultimately conclude the investigation was generally sound but simply stymied by lack of evidence, remains to be seen. After 10 years and 40,000 pages of documentation, certain facts about Inga's disappearance have been established definitively. These aren't theories or speculations but verified realities that any resolution of the case must account for. Inga was last seen alive at approximately 6:30 on the evening of May 2, 2015, on a 100-meter footpath at the Diakoniewerk Wilhelmshof facility. Her father saw her carrying water bottles toward the grill area. 2 other children saw her walking back toward the house. She never arrived. By 6:45, she was gone. The search operation that followed was the largest in German history. Over 1,500 personnel, 4,700 hectares searched, every building examined, every pond drained. Not a single item belonging to Inga was ever found. No clothing, no shoes, no hair ties, no physical evidence whatsoever. GPS tracking dogs established that Inga had moved primarily along the forest edge before she disappeared, not deep into the woodland. There was no continuous scent trail leading into the forest after she vanished. Bloodhounds didn't alert anywhere on the facility grounds. If someone carried her away, the dogs should have indicated that path. They didn't. Scent dogs picked up what appeared to be Inga's trail, 50 kilometers away near the A2 Autobahn, tracking toward Berlin, then through Dessau to Halle, onto the A14 and A4 toward Dresden. The trail was lost. But the implication is that Inga may have been transported by vehicle away from Wilhelmshof. The investigation has also definitively ruled out certain scenarios and suspects. Inga did not get lost in the forest and die of exposure or injury. Thermal imaging would have detected her in the hours immediately after she vanished. Search dogs would have tracked her scent. Ground searches covering thousands of hectares repeatedly would have found remains or clothing. Inga did not drown in any of the water sources at or near Wilhelmshof. Every pond, pit, and water source within miles was drained and searched. Divers examined them before draining. Nothing was found. Silvio Schultz, the child killer, convicted in 2016, did not abduct Inga. He had a cast-iron alibi for May 2, 2015. He was definitively somewhere else. Christian Brückner, the Madeleine McCann prime suspect, most likely did not abduct Inga. His cell phone records place him elsewhere during the relevant time frame. While the family's lawyer argues for more thorough investigation, the cell phone evidence is strong enough that prosecutors consider him effectively ruled out. Despite everything investigators have established and ruled out, the core questions remain unanswered. Who took Inga from that footpath? How did they do it without leaving physical evidence? Where did they take her? What happened to her? Is she alive or dead? If dead, where are her remains? The identity of the white van driver remains unknown. Whether that van was even connected to Inga's disappearance remains unproven. It's a lead, but not necessarily a meaningful one. Whether someone at Wilhelmshof was involved remains unresolved. Jens Uwe Gehricke's lingering suspicions about the facility and its inhabitants haven't been validated by evidence, but they haven't been definitively disproven either. The investigation of facility residents and staff was extensive but might have missed something. Martin H.'s potential connection remains unresolved, made worse by the disappearance of 1,900 pages of investigative file. Without that documentation, it's impossible to know what leads were pursued, what connections were examined, what evidence might have been collected. The 11-day investigation seems insufficient, but without the files, there's no way to reconstruct what was actually done. The validity of the A2 motorway scent trail remains uncertain. Scent dogs can be highly reliable, but they're not infallible. The trail might have been genuine, indicating Inga was transported by vehicle, or it might have been a false positive, leading investigators away from where Inga actually is. The Halle Cold Case Unit continues to focus on several priority areas. They're still seeking decomposed clothing or human remains in the forest around Wilhelmshof. Despite 14 search operations covering thousands of hectares, they believe it's possible something was missed, particularly if buried carefully or hidden in a location that's been searched but not exhaustively. They're seeking witnesses who saw any vehicle leaving Wilhelmshof around 6:30 to 8 o'clock on the evening of May 2, 2015. The white van sighting remains the most concrete potential lead, but there might have been other vehicles that left around that time that weren't reported or weren't considered significant. They're seeking anyone with knowledge of activities near Wilhelmshof on that specific date. Someone might have seen something that didn't seem important at the time but takes on new significance with hindsight. Someone might have noticed unusual behavior from a resident, staff member, or visitor. Someone might have information they didn't share in 2015 for reasons that no longer apply. The €50,000 reward is specifically designed to motivate someone who has information to finally come forward. The hope is that financial incentive might overcome whatever has kept that person quiet for 10 years. One aspect of the case that Professor Labuddy's theory highlighted is the psychological dimension of what might have happened. If Inga went willingly with someone, that changes the investigative calculus entirely. It means looking for someone who could plausibly approach a child and convince her to go with them. That could be someone who looked official or authoritative. Someone in a uniform or wearing identification that suggested they worked at the facility. Someone the other children knew and trusted, making Inga think it was safe to go with them. It could be someone who presented a scenario that appealed to a 5-year-old's desire to be helpful, telling her they needed help finding something, asking her to show them where something was, creating a sense of urgency that made her think she needed to go with them immediately. It could be someone who simply had the social skills to quickly establish rapport with a child. Some people are naturally good with children, can quickly make them feel comfortable and trusting. If someone with those skills had malicious intent, they could potentially convince a child to go with them in a very short time frame. This psychological dimension suggests investigators should be looking not just at violent criminals or people with abduction histories, but at anyone who had both opportunity and the personality characteristics that would allow them to convince a 5-year-old to go willingly. For Victoria and Jens Ove Gehricke and their 3 other children, the 10 years since Inga disappeared have been a waking nightmare, with no end in sight. They can't grieve properly because they don't know definitively that she's dead. They can't move forward because the mystery remains unsolved. They're trapped in permanent uncertainty. Victoria's statement that the terrible uncertainty is the worst captures this perfectly. Human beings can process grief when someone dies. We have cultural rituals, religious frameworks, psychological mechanisms for dealing with death. But we don't have good ways to process permanent uncertainty about whether someone we love is alive or dead. Every birthday, August 18th, is a reminder of another year Inga has been gone. Every Christmas is missing one person at the table. Every family milestone, every graduation or achievement by the other children, carries the shadow of Inga's absence. The media attention that accompanies major anniversaries or new developments is both necessary and traumatic. It keeps public focus on the case, which might lead to tips or breakthroughs. But it also forces the family to relive the worst day of their lives repeatedly, to talk publicly about their pain, to see Inga's photo and age progression images on television and in newspapers. Inga's case shares characteristics with several other famous European missing child cases, and examining those cases reveals patterns about what typically happens and what occasionally results in resolution. Madeleine McCann disappeared in 2007 and has never been found. Despite her case generating more international attention and investigative resources than perhaps any missing child case in history. Christian Brückner is the prime suspect, but prosecutors haven't been able to bring charges due to insufficient evidence. The case demonstrates that, even with unlimited resources, some mysteries prove nearly impossible to solve. René Hasse disappeared in 1996 from a German train station at age 6. His case remained unsolved for decades. In 2015, a man confessed to killing René and led police to his remains. That case demonstrates that confessions sometimes come decades later, that perpetrators sometimes eventually crack under the weight of guilt or changed circumstances. Yvonne Ost was murdered in Bavaria in 2009. DNA evidence existed but couldn't identify a suspect until 2022, when genealogical DNA techniques finally matched the profile to a suspect who was subsequently charged. That case demonstrates how advances in forensic technology can crack cases that seemed unsolvable. What these cases reveal is that missing child investigations sometimes resolve quickly, sometimes never resolve at all, and sometimes resolve after many years through confession, new evidence, or technological advances. Inga's case could still fall into any of those categories. One uncomfortable truth about criminal investigations is that luck plays a larger role than anyone wants to acknowledge. Investigators can be brilliant, thorough, dedicated, and still not solve a case if certain elements don't break their way. Finding physical evidence often requires luck. A search team has to happen to look in exactly the right spot. Weather conditions have to be right for dogs to pick up scents. Someone has to notice something that seems trivial but turns out to be crucial. Witness testimony requires lucky timing. Someone has to have been looking in the right direction at the right moment. They have to remember what they saw. They have to think it's significant enough to report. They have to come forward rather than deciding it's not their problem. Suspect identification sometimes requires lucky breaks. Someone mentions something to police that creates a connection. A different investigation stumbles across evidence that relates to your case. A forensic technique that didn't exist when the crime occurred gets developed and can be applied to old evidence. Inga's case may be unsolved, not because investigators have been incompetent, but because the right lucky break hasn't occurred yet. The person who knows something hasn't come forward. The search team hasn't looked in the one spot where evidence exists. The forensic technique that would crack the case hasn't been developed yet. The realistic question 10 years later is whether the Inga Gehricke case could still be solved. Is resolution possible, or has too much time passed, too much evidence degraded, too many witnesses' memories faded? The answer is yes. Resolution remains possible, though the pathways to that resolution have narrowed. A confession is possible. Someone who was involved, either as the perpetrator, or as an accomplice, or as someone who helped cover up the crime, could decide to come forward. Guilt, changed circumstances, the €50,000 reward, or simply the desire for resolution could motivate someone to finally tell the truth. Remains could still be found. If Inga's body is buried in that forest, improved technology, or simply searching in the right spot during the right season could lead to discovery. If she's buried elsewhere, some unrelated excavation or construction project could uncover her remains, leading to identification through DNA. Genealogical DNA techniques that have solved decades-old cold cases in recent years could potentially be applicable if any DNA evidence exists. If there's a sample that couldn't be identified through traditional databases, running it through genealogical databases might identify familial connections that lead to a suspect. Someone who was present at Wilhelmshof that day might finally remember something or decide to share what they saw: a deathbed confession, a relationship ending, and one partner revealing what the other told them. Someone's conscience finally overwhelming their reasons for staying silent. The scenario everyone involved fears is that the case will never be solved, that Inga's fate will remain unknown permanently, that whoever took her will never be identified or face justice, that her remains will never be recovered, that Victoria and Yenzue and their other children will live the rest of their lives without ever knowing what happened. This outcome is more common than the public realizes. Many missing person cases are never resolved. The person simply vanishes, leaving behind grieving families and baffled investigators. There's no closure, no answers, no justice. Just permanent uncertainty and loss. For the Gehricke family, this would mean spending decades wondering if every young woman they see might be Inga. It would mean never being able to properly grieve, because they can't know for certain she's dead. It would mean Inga's siblings growing up and potentially having children of their own while still not knowing what happened to their sister. For investigators, it would mean the case file remaining open indefinitely, periodically reviewed as new leads come in or new technology becomes available, but never reaching resolution. It would mean admitting that despite the largest search operation in German history, despite thousands of investigative hours, despite extensive media coverage and substantial rewards, they simply couldn't solve it. The Inga Gehricke case remains open and active under the Halle Cold Case Unit. The 8 investigators assigned to it continue working through leads, conducting searches when warranted, and reviewing evidence. The case has not been abandoned or deprioritized. The €50,000 reward remains available for information leading to Inga's discovery or the identification and conviction of whoever took her. That reward will remain active indefinitely, assuming no one comes forward to claim it. The dedicated website www.inga-suche.de continues to accept tips and information from the public. Anyone with information can also contact Kripo Stendal at 03931 685 291 or any German police station. The True Fruit Smoothie Bottle campaign generated over 40 new tips as of late 2024. Each of those tips is being investigated, though whether any will lead to a breakthrough remains unknown. Additional public awareness campaigns may be planned for future anniversaries. DNA testing results from Christian Brückner's seized van have not been publicly disclosed. If usable DNA evidence was found linking the van to Inga or other victims, charges could potentially be brought. The lack of public announcement suggests either no evidence was found or evidence was found, but prosecutors are keeping it confidential as part of an ongoing investigation. The Inga Gehricke case represents one of modern Germany's most haunting unsolved mysteries. A 5-year-old girl vanished in broad daylight from a 100-meter footpath, surrounded by family and friends, during a simple weekend barbecue. Despite Germany's largest ever missing person search operation, despite investigating multiple suspects, including the Madeleine McCann prime suspect, despite generating over 2,000 tips across a decade, investigators cannot definitively explain what happened in that 15-minute window. The case has exposed potential failures in the investigation, including a psychologist romantically involved with the lead investigator and the mysterious disappearance of 1,900 pages of files on a key suspect. The 2023 transfer to a specialized cold case unit represents both acknowledgement of problems and commitment to a fresh approach. For criminologists and investigators, the case raises troubling questions about how someone can abduct a child from a populated facility, leave no physical evidence, and evade detection despite massive search efforts. For the public, it serves as a reminder of how quickly a normal day can turn into tragedy, how vulnerable children remain despite safety measures, and how some mysteries may never be fully explained. For Victoria and Jens Uwe Gehricke, their 3 other children, and everyone who loved Inga, the case is an ongoing nightmare without end. Every day brings the same uncertainty, the same questions, the same absence. Until Inga is found or someone confesses, they remain trapped in that moment when a 5-year-old girl walked down a footpath and never arrived. If there's anything positive to be drawn from Inga's disappearance, it's the changes her case prompted in how German authorities handle missing children cases. The initial investigation's failures led to reforms in investigative procedures, improved coordination between agencies, and better protocols for immediate response when children vanish. The case demonstrated the value of massive immediate response. While 1,500 personnel didn't find Inga, the scale of that response meant that if she had been findable through search efforts, she would have been found. Future cases benefit from the lessons learned about deploying resources quickly and comprehensively. The subsequent scrutiny of the investigation, particularly the revelations about compromised objectivity and missing files, has led to reforms in how investigators are supervised and how evidence is managed. The transfer to a cold case unit with fresh eyes represents acknowledgement that long-running investigations need periodic, external review to avoid institutional biases. The True Fruits Bottle campaign represents innovative thinking about how to keep cold cases in public consciousness. Traditional missing person posters and periodic TV segments have limited impact. Putting Inga's face and story on 30,000 products that people handle and take home represents a new approach that generated dozens of tips and renewed attention. Someone knows what happened to Inga Gehricke. That someone might be the person who took her. It might be someone who saw something that day and didn't realize its significance. It might be someone who heard a confession or noticed suspicious behavior. It might be someone who helped after the fact, disposing of evidence or providing a false alibi. That person has lived with that knowledge for 10 years. They've watched the media coverage. They've seen Inga's photo. They've heard Victoria Gehricke talk about the terrible uncertainty. They've observed the massive searches and the anguish of a family destroyed by not knowing. For whatever reason, fear or guilt or loyalty or self-interest, that person hasn't come forward. But circumstances change. Relationships end, guilty consciences intensify, financial needs grow. The €50,000 reward becomes more attractive. The weight of carrying the secret becomes unbearable. Cold cases often break when that person finally decides to speak. When they make an anonymous call providing a crucial detail. When they approach police through a lawyer. When they confess to a friend or family member who then contacts authorities. When they decide, 10 years later or 20 years later, or on their deathbed, that they need to finally tell the truth. Inga Gehricke vanished on May 2, 2015, during a 15-minute window that changed her family's lives forever. She was 5 years old, carrying water bottles to help at a barbecue, walking a 100-meter footpath at a Christian charity facility. She never arrived at either end of that path. She simply ceased to exist in any way that left evidence. 10 years later, despite the largest search operation in German history, despite thousands of investigative hours, despite extensive media coverage and substantial rewards, the case remains unsolved. The questions that were unanswerable on May 2, 2015, remain unanswerable today. Is Inga alive or dead? If alive, where has she been for 10 years? If dead, where are her remains? Who took her? How did they do it without leaving evidence? Why hasn't anyone come forward with information? The Halle Cold Case Unit continues working. The family continues hoping for answers. The public continues following the case. And somewhere, someone knows the truth. Whether that truth will ever be revealed remains the final mystery in a case defined by mysteries. Inga Gehricke would be 16 years old today, turning 16 on August 18, 2025. If she's alive somewhere, she's now spent 2/3 of her life away from the family that still waits for answers. If she's dead, she deserves to be found and properly laid to rest. Either way, the truth deserves to emerge from whatever shadows it's been hidden in for the past decade. For now, the case endures as Germany's Madeleine McCann, a haunting reminder of how quickly a child can disappear and how difficult it can be to find them again. The investigation continues, the search goes on, and the hope persists that somehow, someday, the truth about what happened to Inga Gehricke will finally come to light.